Hi again. So I was trying to only make this just one lecture with Mrs. T at the beginning of this week and then the rest curated videos, but surprise, I have a lot to say about this subject. So my video was getting a little too long. It was going to cut me off at 15 minutes and I have a little bit more than 5 minutes to say things about this language and power issue. So you might have noticed in the last lecture, I had a statement written on the board somewhere down here that said something about being able to use language as a weapon and that language has been used as a weapon in the past. And so we're going to talk about power structures and language right now and how language can be used as a place identifier, not just a social identifier. So when we look at those ethnic neighborhoods, for instance, that we examined in a previous week, usually language is a huge identifier where you can see like even demarcation lines. We call those isoglosses. Iso meaning the same and or meaning a line on a map, that is, and gloss meaning the language. So an isogloss is like a line on the map where you can see a language or a dialect or a vernacular spoken, below and then a different one above or east-west or whatever. Okay, so language and power is a major subject. It's one that I'm very interested in, so that's why we're doing a different lecture here. So language definitely can be weaponized, and what I mean when I say this is that over history, over time, and you'll watch a video about the transition of languages from one place to the next and the way that the culture was imported or moved with people as they moved from one place to the next. There are some people who conquer other lands. Now, this was not a huge issue among different cultures when the world's population was small and we only had foraging, horticulture, or pastoralism as our subsistence strategies. But remember, with agriculture, when land became very, very valuable, there were lots of, and populations grew, there were lots of motivations for people to move from their place of origin outward and expand in a variety of directions. Usually those directions were not unpopulated to begin with, and typically languages were different, at least dialects were different. And so when those different language groups came in contact with each other, typically erasing the language of the conquered people was one of the quickest ways to get rid of the evidence of that old culture and take over a region. And so language is weaponized in that way. And it didn't just only happen in that way throughout history. You can look at examples in the United States with the Native American relocation schools and the programs, when Native Americans were collected and hauled off against their will from, say, Georgia to Oklahoma to farther west, right? During, starts with Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. Thank you, Andrew Jackson, for really completing the job. So anyway, during that time, you see Native American dialects and languages being outlawed, like it was not allowed, and literally Native children abducted from their families, sometimes through just sneaky means, and other times literally. I'm not using the word abduction as an inflammatory word here, but they were forced into schools where their native languages were not allowed. They were only allowed to speak English, and that's it. And that was one of the ways to erase the differences in culture from one society to the next. So there's lots of examples of this throughout history. One of my best friends comes from Lebanon, and she went to French schools when she was little, and France occupied Lebanon for a long time, and those French schools, her native Arabic language that she spoke at home was not allowed. Although Arabic is one of those languages that has spread over time, and native speakers of Arabic typically overtake the indigenous cultures or the aboriginal cultures of an area and force others to speak Arabic instead. In this case, it was flipped, and the French were forcing people in Lebanon to speak, people who went to their compulsory schools anyway, to speak French. So, and there's a whole lot of angst and conflict that still exists in the world today regarding language speaking and your choice of language. For instance, there are some huge portion of the population in French-speaking Canada that absolutely refuse to speak English or even learn it. They won't allow it in the street signs on their street because of that cultural identity marker, that social identity marker that is so personal, and they protect it a whole lot because they want that solidarity that language can bring. So language is definitely something that can be weaponized, and it can be more subtle than that also. Because within our society, where we have English as the most common language, I mean, it's not an official language of the government. We don't really have that, but we do have what we mentioned in the previous video, standard spoken American English, which is this accentless dialect, if that's even possible, usually associated with like the Midwest, maybe Kansas and Iowa, kind of in that area. It's typically seen as kind of baseline, no Southern accent, no West Coast, East Coast accent, no Yankee accent. It's just kind of standard, thus the name, standard spoken American English. This is typically, in the business world, the accent that supervisors and people who hire others are going to want to hear. It's not just an accent, it's also a grammar order. It's also the way we string words together. You've heard in English class of subject-verb agreement, and being able to use words correctly. There's a little video game thing that you can download from the App Store that tests you on whether you're using different words like there, and there. I bet you YouTube is not going to get that spelled correctly on the captioning because I'm talking about T-H-E-R-E, T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E, and T-H-E-I-R. So those different words are all pronounced exactly the same, but when are we supposed to use them in the meaning? And so that's also part of standard spoken American English. Or the word accept with E-X-C-E-P-T, or accept, A-C-C-E-P-T. What do those two words mean? And the word to, T-W-O, T-O-O, T-O. Like how and when are we supposed to use these things? And so that's also part of standard spoken American English. The assumption that you have that basic language learning in your upbringing that has just those basic grammar rules. You know, you grasp them essentially. So it's more than just an accent. It's also the way things are written. You know, so if you produce memos in the workplace, or if you write copy for the teleprompter for, you know, people, anchor people to deliver it in the news, this is the kind of thing that they expect the power structure expects you to have. Okay, so I have another acronym over here on the board. African-American vernacular English. So remember, vernacular is something that I asked you to look up in the last video. Vernacular is the common everyday language that's spoken. And so there is a different grammatical pattern, there's a different accent pattern, there are different words that mean different things in African-American vernacular English that set people apart as historically subordinate groups to the dominant group in society. You can look up, gosh, I guess it's been like 30 years ago now, in the Oakland school system. I think it has been. Maybe even 40 years ago, there was an English second language class, I'm putting air quotes around English second language class, that was offered to the native people of Oakland. I say native because they'd been there for several generations, but most spoke African American vernacular English, and it was a major barrier toward employment after high school, because high school did not prepare those students to be able to transition or translate into standard spoken American English in order to go into the workforce. And at the time, 30, 40 years ago when this was happening, that was found to be one of the major obstacles for the high school graduates in the Oakland School District. You know, an obstacle against employment, because employers, if an employer needed you to communicate with customers on the phone, in the store in person, or write things, you know, to put in the paper or something, they couldn't hire you if you didn't have the standard spoken American English. And so it was a major controversy. You know, some people were mad about it. I'm not sure why, but the African-American vernacular English, known as Ebonics, was designated as a second language, and people who came from homes that spoke Ebonics, that was the common word, the vernacular term for African-American vernacular English. So people who spoke this in the household were offered second language job skills classes so that they knew how to compose a resume, they knew how to speak differently. Code switch is what we call it, with employers, with people on the phone, with professors in college, if that's where they were headed, so that they wouldn't be singled out or be suppressed or oppressed or discriminated against based on a language barrier. And yes, I'm saying language barrier, even though this is English and this is English. But that's another way that language can be weaponized. Also, in Arkansas, I see it a lot. I have a stepson who was adopted from Mexico. I have a ton of students who come from other Central American places, Mexico included, and they joke sometimes about Spanglish, which is, of course, a mixture of two words, Spanish and English. And sometimes languages, when they come in contact with each other, just like cultures can assimilate, when languages diffuse, certain new offshoots of a language can result. I mentioned French a minute ago. Well, the Creole languages of South Louisiana are kind of somewhat Caribbean, somewhat English, somewhat Spanish even, and a lot of French, a whole lot of French. The pronunciation is not that way, but it's called a Creole language. That's what Spanglish is. And so when you speak the accent, the word choice, the word order, the kinds of pronouns you do or don't use, the subject-verb agreement you do or don't use, these kinds of things can set you apart ethnically from the dominant population. And language is one of the first markers that can identify us as other in society when we hear the accent that we use, the dialect that we use, the vernacular, etc. So language and power, big deal. So when you're watching these next videos that are curated for you, please keep all of the elements of Mr. Help in mind, but also these elements of language as a social identifier and language in the power structure, and how certain cultures can, I mean, maybe you think I'm overreacting if I say a genocide can happen without actually killing the people if their language is amputated from their daily life, like some conquering groups force conquered people to remove their origin language from their behaviors moving forward. Soon that culture itself, all the core components of that culture, is no more. So think about that. You're going to look at the origin of like language families in general, and the origins and the transition of language, English specifically, in another video. And then you're going to hear dialects of English along the East Coast, really, and part of the South, from that linguist I mentioned. And then there's also an interactive map article that I have for you to read this week. Please text me with questions. Bye.